An event that would have enormous consequences had humble beginnings. At a tea table in Waterloo, the early women's rights movement in America was born. In the house of Jane Hunt, she, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and other like-minded women created an announcement for a women's rights convention that would take place at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls. On July 11, 1848, the unsigned notice appeared on the Seneca County Courier advertising a women's rights convention to take place only 8 days later. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a woman who would soon come to be known as one of the champions of the early women's rights movement, was at the head. 40 years after the meeting that would be called the Seneca Falls Convention, Susan B. Anthony, a prominent women's rights advocate, said that women had not been discovered 50 years ago. The convention was the beginning of women's true discovery. The Seneca Falls Convention took place in July of 1848 over the course of 2 days. It was organized and led by women, being the first event of its kind, with both men and women coming together to discuss the opposition females faced and to demand for their equality. The convention took place during the Age of Reform, a period of history where Americans, inspired by such things as the French Revolution, were buzzing with the desire for social change. Movements like the anti-slavery and the temperance movements gained traction as the common man and the cry for justice rose to previously unknown heights. Women's rights were brought about through the abolition movement, with the realization that women were discriminated against in this and other reform movements. Interestingly enough, the women's rights movement was considered one of the most radical of the period. Women's subservient positions were reinforced by law and religion, with some ministers using the Bible to justify their positions in society. They were to keep to the home and to raise the children with moral values, content with a life of domesticity. The view that women were inherently inferior was widespread and acknowledged as truth by many. This belief was so ingrained in society at the time that there were many women who didn't understand the fight for women's rights. Advocates of the movement were faced with the challenge of convincing other women that they deserved the same treatment and rights as men. They needed to fight. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the lead organizers of the convention and a fighter for women's rights. She, along with Lucretia Coffin Mott, another prominent women's rights advocate, organized the convention. Stanton, as Macmillan says, was the driving intellect of the women's movement. She grew up in a home where she had to take on the role of her deceased brother, giving her insight as to a woman's true capabilities. Lucretia Mott was born into a faith that taught of the equal worth of all humans. She also attended a co-ed boarding school, which was unusual for the time. Because of this, she was able to receive the same level of education as her brothers, when most women of the time did not advance to that level and were not expected to. Working together with other like-minded men and women, they organized the convention that would become the catalyst for the women's rights movement in America. The first day was only for women, and Stanton gave a speech that outlined the purpose of the meeting, citing injustices such as unequal pay, inability to vote, and to declare women's rights to be free as a man is free. She also introduced the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, a document that articulated the injustices that women faced at the time and presented potential solutions to right those injustices. The Declaration was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, with the second paragraph beginning with the edited but familiar line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." The rest of the convention was filled by speakers condemning the oppression women faced and the men who perpetuated it, including Frederick Douglass. Douglass was a freed black man and a well-known advocate for the rights of black people, and was the only man to speak at the convention in favor of women's rights. Stanton said that he was the only man she had truly met who truly understood their plight. Of his support of the women's rights movement, he said, "Self was out of the question, and I found a little nobility in the act." The convention had around 300 people in attendance, but did not have a very far reach. What catapulted it into the social stratosphere of the states was the reporting of the event. Many newspaper editors were furious with the event, as Gurko notes, with one calling it the most unnatural incident ever recorded in the history of humanity. The Herald in New York wrote a scathing article and included the entirety of the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, only giving it more publicity. The event itself was radical, but its consequences were even more so. It led to a second convention and to the formation of groups of men and women organizing women's rights meetings. In these groups, they wrote and spoke to public officials petitioning for women's suffrage. More than ever, women were determined to change the laws that oppressed them. Women's rights became a topic of interest at other conventions at the time and led to subsequent conventions that had even more reach. Women that rose to fame as a result were Sojourner Truth and Paulina Wright Davis. It took 72 years after the convention for the 19th Amendment to be passed, granting women suffrage, enough time that every signer of the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments had died but one. Though progress was and still can seem to be too slow, the effects of the convention are undeniable. Stanton called the event the greatest movement for human liberty recorded on the pages of history, a demand for freedom to one half of the entire race.